afternoon, my friends.
Good afternoon.
Judith, is this relevant to my presentation? Awfully good to be with you. Especially delighted to be here for the personal reason that you probably know. I grew up, well, let me just say, I'm obsessed with the problem of nuclear weapons, but I came by my obsession honestly. And BU is an important part of my having come to this place in my life. I'm the son of a soldier. I grew up on military bases, especially in the shadow of the Pentagon, where my father was a senior Air Force officer. Not too much to say that he was a member of the nuclear priesthood. He ended his career as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, working almost around the clock on the war in Vietnam, which is when I came of age. And the great question was, how would I ever get out from under the shadow of my father's powerful, quite moral, quite heroic, patriotic commitment to the work of the American military establishment. And it wasn't clear to me that I would really ever get out from under that shadow. And then an odd thing happened. I was a seminarian through the 1960s, and in 1969, I was ordained to the Catholic priesthood. And 50 years ago this month, I was assigned to Boston University as a Catholic chaplain. And Boston University dragged me out of my father's shadow. I was only a priest for 5 years, all 5 years as a chaplain here. My priesthood was entirely taken up by the war in Vietnam. And when it ended, I had lost my ability to be the obedient, docile, well-behaved sort of person you have to be, or so I thought at the time, to be a Catholic priest. The story's a little different now, alas. So that's why I'm glad to be here, and it's not incidental, my subject, because I was baptized in the anti-war movement and in resistance to nuclear war here. Judith and I met, as she just told you, at the Parliament for World Religions, and our first thought was that I would repeat the, more or less, the paper that I gave there. I'm glad that we're in an informal space and a small enough group that a formal presentation isn't really necessary. I want to lift up the main idea I had. When I was invited to be a speaker at the World Parliament of Religions, or the Parliament of World Religions, they left to me the subject I would address, and I said, well, I wouldn't come to speak on anything except I would like to issue a call to the religious people gathered there to reignite their commitment to stop and eliminate nuclear weapons. And they said, okay. I didn't realize until I got there that there were hundreds of presentations, and it's very clear that people could talk about whatever they wanted. I have no illusions about myself or about things I do, and certainly not about that. But you may know, Judith, that a few days after we met, the governing body of the Parliament of World Religions did issue a call for the elimination of nuclear weapons. A passionate plea to the leaders of all religions, all people of goodwill, and all leaders of nations, both with and without nuclear weapons, to commit to work to eliminate these horrific devices forever. I jumped at the chance when Judith invited me to come here because this is an important center of religious thought. And I want to, if not repeat the same lecture, I want to lift up the same idea. And I want to return to an exemplary example, that's redundant. I want to return to one of the defining moments of the first movement against nuclear weapons, which was religious. And one of the things that I'm most bothered by right now is the vast indifference we as a citizenry, we the United States of America, have toward this problem. And my dream is that religious people would once again ignite, in a serious way, a movement against the initiation of the new nuclear age, which is what we're living through right now. I thought instead of, reading this long paper, that what I would do to get things going is read to you the thing I'm writing right now, which is an essay that will, I'll submit it probably to Tom Dispatch, which is a left-wing website that publishes a lot on War and Peace, or maybe I'll submit it to the New Yorker, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's what I most care about. And it was in preparing and thinking about coming here to be with you that I found myself needing to write this. So I'll read what I've just been writing as of today. Isn't that quaint? I have to save it for the Howard Gottlieb archives at Boston University. And they don't get handwritten manuscripts anymore, but that's probably the only reason I'm collected there. So let me just take a very few minutes and read this, and then I'll elaborate on the idea, and then we can have a conversation. Filed this under the heading of broken record, as in sounding like. I say that, I sound like a broken record. I said it to my son once, and he looked at me and said, "What's a record?" That was before vinyl made its comeback. Filed this under the heading of broken record, as in sounding like. Every few months comes a report of yet another pin being removed from the structure of nuclear arms control, a steady dismantling of what may be the single greatest diplomatic achievement in human history. The arms control regime constructed jointly by the United States and the Soviet Union between the eras of John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, of Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev, did nothing less than save the planet from the catastrophe of nuclear war that every high-placed realist on both sides of the Iron Curtain regarded as all but inevitable. Because that catastrophe was avoided, the astounding work of the nuclear arms negotiators who turned back the rushing current of all-out war is so taken for granted that today's generation of high-placed realists feel free to trash it. Item. On Saturday, February 2nd, this Saturday, the United States formally begins to suspend compliance with the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a decision announced by the Trump administration last October. The withdrawal begins on Saturday. Item. On January 28th, yesterday, the United States announced that it had begun the manufacture at the Pantex nuclear weapons plant in Texas of a new low-yield nuclear warhead for its Trident missile. The first operational warheads will be delivered in September of this year. The new warhead will carry 1/3 of the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, making it, in the minds of the new nuclear priesthood, a usable nuke, one that will, in the words of the Pentagon's 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, provide an American president with flexibility. Flexibility, obviously, to initiate a nuclear war not as a last resort, but as a means of tactical dominance. The absolute weapon is being normalized, and starting here in the United States, the absolute taboo against nuclear use in place since 1945 is being eliminated. That was yesterday. The first new nuclear weapon in decades. Item. On January 17th, so last week, Trump went to the Pentagon to announce that his new United States Space Force will be built around a space-based missile defense laser technology, another name for the long discredited Star Wars fantasy of Ronald Reagan. Reagan's dream always emphasized the defensive nature of the system, but not Trump, who crowed that his system will be, quote, a very, very big part of our defense and obviously of our offense, unquote. Welcome at last to the weaponizing of space, a trashing of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which defined space by all nations as a global commons of peace, exempt from war. Item. In the last week of January, so a couple of days ago, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists announced that the hands of its doomsday clock, set every year to track the danger of nuclear catastrophe, would be stuck at 2 minutes to midnight for the second year in a row. For 2 years now, the doomsday clock, tracking the danger of nuclear war, has been calibrated at the same moment it was last seen in 1953. None of this is news. The Trump administration published its Nuclear Posture Review 1 full year ago, last February. It was explicit in its proud initiation of a new nuclear age, enthused repudiation of the Obama-era Nuclear Posture Review, which had embraced the purpose of eventual nuclear abolition. Last June, Trump announced the establishment of the U.S. Space Force as a sixth branch of the U.S. military services. It is not enough, he said, to merely have American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. In the last year, the Pentagon has let out contracts for a new hyper-stealth nuclear cruise missile and for the replacement of the 40-year-old Minuteman silo-launched ICBMs, an obsolete system that was, until then, being phased out. To repeat, none of this is news. You may have taken note of some of these things, but if you did, you're very unusual. As readers of this site, I'm thinking now of the Tom Dispatch site, which is obsessed with climate change. As readers of this site see emphasized again and again, the current administration's demonic neglect of the climate crisis hastens the world down perdition road to a point of no return. But it is doing the very same thing with its resurrection of nuclear madness. And that is not news. Arms control, that precious alphabet soup of INF, NPT, SALT, START, New START, a cooperative achievement of both Moscow and Washington, represented nothing less than a world historic reckoning with an ancient but all too unlearned lesson, namely that every human advance in offensive capability leads inexorably to a matching advance in defensive capability. What the Pentagon and the Kremlin did with high-tech weapons for 2 generations, humans have been doing since the dawn of time. From my rock generates your shield to my atomic bomb generates your hydrogen bomb to my ICBM generates your ABM. The dream of obtaining a weapon or weapon system that will give me or my nation dominance, in Trump's word, is a deadly delusion, a delusion that is ultimately both genocidal and self-defeating. The news here, although you would not know that this is news if all you went by is the news media, is that the United States has fallen under an amnesiac spell. The present cohort of military theorists and decision makers, empowered by Trump, act as if they have entirely forgotten what was so painfully learned during the long nightmare of the US-USSR nuclear standoff. They have forgotten it, or maybe they're too young to know about it.
Maybe.
Every weapons advance on one side was matched by the other, which led to a further advance and a further matching until the world was awash with nuclear weapons. So many nuclear weapons that nobody knew what the number was, in the many tens of thousands. That not one of them was launched or fired or dropped qualifies as a miracle. Well, no, not a miracle. The nonviolent resolution of the Cold War came about through brave, sustained efforts of scientist negotiators on both sides across a full generation, with politicians finally being forced to stop the arms race when vast populations of ordinary people on both sides rose up to demand first a freeze, and then limitation, and then reduction. Those demands came from below. The tide turned. The inevitable phenomenon of widespread nuclear proliferation turned out not to be turned out not to be inevitable. The miracle of the 20th century is that there are only 9 nuclear weapon states, when there could so easily be 50 or 80. If Pakistan can have the bomb, any nation can have the bomb with its impoverishment. Nuclear arsenals across decades were destroyed, and the goal of nuclear elimination was embraced on all sides as the height of realism. How can it be that this history is forgotten? How can it be that it is reversed? How can it be that none of this is news? Why do the cable maestros, even of the left, make nothing of this great dismantling? What Democratic presidential candidate has stopping Trump's new nuclear age anywhere on her or his agenda? Item, the human future is being lost in the United States of America. And for all the mainstream notice taken by the media and by politicians, left to right, you might conclude that it does not matter, but it matters. So that's the state of play right this minute. Given the complacency of a vast population, beginning in the United States, on this question, reflected in these momentous events happening over the last 3 weeks, to almost no notice, given that complacency, what can be done? And that's where religion comes in. If religion stands for anything on this planet, it must stand for the opposite of nuclear weapons. It seems a little cockeyed to wish for a serious religious movement against nuclear weapons. But it isn't cockeyed, and I say that because it happened before. So let me turn to that part of the presentation I gave in Toronto, and just indulge me while I read it to you. What can we do? First, we can remember that miracle of the Gorbachev-Reagan agreement in 1987, what the United States is obliterating come Saturday. What led directly to the other agreements? It was the first arms reduction agreement. And ultimately to the end of the Cold War, would not have happened without the movement from below that Gorbachev referred to. Millions upon millions of ordinary people shaking off the lethargy of nuclear despair to say no more. In Europe, the Ban the Bomb movement and the protests against cruise missiles and Pershing missiles. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Solidarity movement and the nonviolent grassroots resistance supported by Pope John Paul II. Inside Russia itself, the campaign by Soviet Jews and the dissent of leading scientists like Andrei Sakharov. Many, many of these people, citing the examples of religious figures like Mahatma Gandhi, his disciples Martin Luther King Jr., the Catholic Berrigan brothers, their mentor Dorothy Day, William Sloane Coffin, Helen Caldicott, Elizabeth McAllister, and the countless numbers of rabbis, priests, ministers, nuns, and religiously engaged women and men who took their inspiration from, say, Buddhist prophets like Thich Nhat Hanh, whom I heard address a congregation in Marsh Chapel. And finally, an exemplary instance of religious opposition to nuclear weapons came from an unlikely source. The Catholic bishops of the United States, in their 1983 declaration, The Challenge of Peace. The Catholic bishops of the United States? Really? If such a flawed institution can make a crucial intervention for the good on the matter of nuclear weapons at a crucial moment, what institution or tradition represented in the various religious communities, for example, represented at the BU School of Theology, cannot do something comparable? The timing of the Challenge of Peace was crucial, 1983. The then hawkish Ronald Reagan had just ordered a massive increase in the Pentagon budget, something like what's going on now. He was calling Moscow the capital of the evil empire. American cruise missiles were being deployed in Europe for the first time. But Dwight D. Eisenhower had once prophesied, quote, People want peace so much that one of these days, governments had better get out of their way and let them have it. In June of 1982, 1 million people went to the UN to demand a freeze in the nuclear arms race. A movement sparked by a young woman named Randy Forsberg, who began as an MIT grad student across the river. Washington's leaders could dismiss that throng as aging hippies. But Washington could not then dismiss what had been, until then, the heart of patriotic support of American wars, the Catholic bishops. In their pastoral letter, it's true, the bishops failed to take on the lethal amorality of deterrence theory, and their statement could have been stronger. But its bottom line objection to the nuclear status quo rang loud and clear. They firmly denounced nuclear weapons and demanded, quote, a moral about-face. This shocked America, no one more than Catholics. The bishops wrote, quote, the nuclear age is an age of moral as well as physical danger. We are the first generation since Genesis with the power to threaten the created order. We cannot remain silent in the face of such danger. Their letter was read in every Catholic church in America, at every Mass, across a month. It was a key part of what prepared Ronald Reagan to make the world historic shift in attitude that enabled him to say yes to Mikhail Gorbachev, his stunning proposal to end the arms race with the INF Treaty, which the United States is trashing on Saturday. But the bishops did not just denounce, and that has important meaning for people like us. They proposed pragmatic strategies to advance the cause of that moral about-face. They expressly addressed specific groups with specific responsibilities. They called on the media to be critical in the matter of government rhetoric. Quote, there should be a clear public resistance to the rhetoric of winnable nuclear wars or unrealistic expectations of surviving nuclear exchanges and strategies of protracted nuclear war. We oppose such rhetoric. How about opposing the rhetoric of a usable nuclear weapon? We should oppose today's version of exactly that rhetoric and the echoes that are sure to come now from Moscow and Beijing, because the old dynamic is set in motion once again. Our advance prompts their matching it, which will prompt our further advance and their further matching it. The bishops expressly addressed educators, particularly those for whom they had denominational responsibility. We urge every diocese and parish to implement balanced and objective educational programs to help people at all levels to understand better the issues of war and peace. The bishops spoke directly in specific sections of the declaration, not only to public officials, but to men and women in the military, in the defense industries, and in science, inviting them, in effect, to examine their consciences. But above all, they spoke to citizens of their grave obligation not to be complacent on this question. Citizens ultimately are the responsible ones. Citizens of the nuclear powers whose governments threaten the future in their name, and citizens of the world whose very future is at stake. Going beyond the rationale of political realism, the bishops took care to express convictions rooted in religious faith as such, whether anyone perceived it as realistic or not. And this has relevance here. 5 years before the totally unexpected rapprochement between Moscow and Washington, they wrote, "To believe we are condemned in the future only to what has been the past of US-Soviet relations is to underestimate both our human potential for creative diplomacy and God's action in our midst, which can open the way to changes we could barely imagine." Do we believe, faced with the inexorable resumption of the nuclear arms race in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, do we believe we are condemned to this future by this past? If that is our faith, if that is our religious faith, it is useless, and it's better left behind. But who are religious figures to ask such political questions? The bishops answered that by saying simply, peacemaking is not an optional commitment. It is a requirement of our faith. We are called to be peacemakers, not by some movement of the moment, but by our Lord Jesus. Or in the case of the diverse religious traditions in a place like BU, by the Holy One who goes by many names or no name. For what unites us as believers above all, this is why I bother to make the case here, is our common conviction that human beings are creatures called to surpass themselves in the unending quest for transcendence. For us, transcendence has a name. And because the reality of that transcendence lives within us and among us, known by whatever name or no name, we are united too by the gift of unending hope, which is rendered in different ways by different traditions. So no, our religious faith is not useless. This history, given the intractable problems we face, is our hope. The miracle of 1989 happened. It can happen again. It is up to the religions of the world to redeem themselves of all the ways they have been misused in the past by making this dream of the future come true. The Holy One wills it, I presume to suggest. So, a bit of a smorgasbord, but there it is, the religious call to the elimination of nuclear weapons. What do you think?
Amen.
Praise the Lord. Some thoughts?
I have a question. In 1986, I was part of a cross-country walk that you probably know called the Great Peace March.
Sure.
And one of the things we focused,
you.
yeah, I was 19. It's what ended up leading me to being a seminarian now at age 52. But one of the things we focused on was a test ban, a nuclear test ban, and it worked. I mean, it was sort of a reachable goal that was it gained popularity. Is this new Trident warhead? Are they going to test that? Is that something we can focus on?
Well, the test ban treaty, the treaty you talked about had to do with underground nuclear test ban. Mm-hmm. Remember, the atmospheric test ban treaty had been agreed to in the 60s, 63. It's one of the questions about a new generation of nuclear weapons is how do they test it? And so far the claim is that the testing, sophisticated testing can be done in the laboratory, they say.
Okay.
But this, it's not clear to me that that's true. And it's not clear where this is headed. The treaties are going out the window. The New START treaty, which is supposed to come into effect and be ratified, has probably been destroyed by what we're doing to the current treaties. So how bound we are, we're not bound to the Treaty on Space now. The treaty regime is what's being trashed. it's hard to, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, out the window. What we're doing now is a violation of our solemn obligation to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it's a good question, but my own feeling is we could do better, that we could just lift up the treaties, lift up the tradition of arms control, lift up the tradition of negotiation, because one by one, the United States government is turning its back on them. The way we turned our back on the Paris Accord, the way we turned our back on the agreement we had with Iran. But the focus on nuclear, I mean, if I were focusing anywhere, it would be on the new generation of nuclear weapons, because that violates everything. Yes, ma'am.
There's so many questions I would like to ask, but right now it seems that maybe the North Korea negotiations might be a point of success for, possible success for our president, which might somehow change his attitude. That's the only hope. I think the whole rest of the feeling about treaties is that they don't really matter anymore, which is just horrible. But
well, North Korea is an interesting case in point. It's a complete fantasy that the North Koreans are going to give up their nuclear weapons. They're not.
Of course, they're not.
The most that we can hope for is that we can engage them to the point that they won't give their nuclear weapons technology to other nations and other groups. That's really what we're, but we have to live with a nuclear North Korea the way we live with a nuclear Pakistan. Trump and his administration continue to put forward, as if it's real, the prospect of nuclear denuclearization in Korea. It's not going to happen. But engaging Korea is very important, because Korea is dangerous, less because of their capacity to launch a nuclear war, because it would just be the end of that state. But they can trade. They're an impoverished country with very little to trade. They can trade nuclear technology. And there are plenty of groups and probably states that would love to get it from them. That would be, but
I think the way that South Korea is meshed in that is also a very positive thing.
absolutely, and that's where the initiative belongs. And our hope is that Trump doesn't mess up what's clearly going on between North and South Korea. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Back in the nuclear freeze movement, many towns in New Hampshire, including mine, passed resolutions. It was a very small thing, but you added it all up, and it became significant. I live in a town that has a town meeting, but larger towns and cities did it in different ways. And there's a similar movement going on now, certainly in New Hampshire, and I believe in many, many places. The Union of Concerned Scientists has developed something called the Back from the Brink resolution. And already this town of Durham, New Hampshire, which is the home of UNH, has their city council passed something like that resolution. And there are a number of other towns that will have either that resolution or a no first use resolution, which is more limited, but still significant, on their ballots, on their town warrants. I don't know about Massachusetts, but I believe that the Back from the Brink campaign, which is being coordinated by Union of Concerned Scientists, is active in many states now. And I know that it's the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is not part of the Society of Friends, but is connected to. The Quakers have been active in this back during the Freeze campaign. They've chosen nuclear weapons as their focus, advocacy focus this year, so that visits to congressional representatives, to their staff, appearances during the primary season by candidates. There will always be people in the audience who will be asking questions about the candidate's stand on nuclear weapons. So there is, you're right that there's a lot of apathy and a lot of ignorance, again, there was also a stirring of something similar to what we saw back during the Freeze campaign. Whether it ends up being that big and widespread remains to be seen.
Right, that's a very useful summary of what's going on. Thank you for it.
Actually, there's a bill in the state legislature right now that the groups in Massachusetts, there are several towns in Western Mass that have already passed something, and there's now a bill to support the ban in the legislature. I don't know who sponsors
Is it the same back from the Brink campaign?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's important to know that. It's also important to remember what the freeze was. Randy Forsberg wrote a statement on one page because at that point in 1981, we were accumulating about 1,000 nuclear warheads a day on our side. And she just said that it was a proposal to just freeze at present levels, right? Not a wild. And your anecdote reminds us that within a year, certainly within 2 years, every time you went to a meeting, if you were a dentist going to a dentist convention, a forester going to a forester's convention, a state legislature, college groups, the basketball team, wherever there were groups of people, somebody would stand up and say, I move that we endorse the freeze resolution. And it happened. And it was like wildfire. And that's what Ronald Reagan went, well, what's that? And it was when Ed Markey, who was a newly elected congressman with everything to lose, introduced the freeze resolution into Congress. And everybody looked at him like, who are you and what? Alexandria Orlando Cortez is tame compared to what Ed Markey did. And he probably would have been cooked, but guess what happened? Ted Kennedy picked up the freeze resolution and introduced it into the Senate. And suddenly, well, within a year, it passed both houses. Reagan had a big problem. And then that's when Reagan's rhetoric changed. He said, I'm not in favor of a freeze. I think we should start reducing these ourselves. I mean, he was trying desperately to get around the word freeze. And the next thing you know, that's what Gorbachev said to him. So Reagan was prepped for Gorbachev by Randy Forsberg. Can one person make a difference? It's a wonderful story. So back from the brink, absolutely. Do it again. Why not? Yes, ma'am.
And I think that there was part of the question that comes up about we don't know how to go back and raise up the treaties to reclaim the tradition of the treaties. We don't know how to negotiate anymore, at least the young people don't, because they're not being taught to negotiate by anybody in the public sphere. And so there's something about formation. Remember that in the 80s, people who were sort of young and active in the early and mid 80s had spent their childhoods learning to duck and cover and where the fallout shelter was. We went through those drills how often? And so it was part of our consciousness growing up that nukes were bad, and that they were dangerous for us. And so that kind of formation that was happening regularly because of the civil defense drills that we had to do was at play in the popular energy against nukes in the 80s. But I would argue that the people who are in their 30s and 40s now missed that formation, and so don't know that it's a crisis, don't know, and so the questions I bring are, so what would we need to do? I mean, given what's going on, we're not going to see FEMA running duck and cover drills anytime soon, I don't think. How do we teach negotiation? How do we teach the risk? How do we teach caring for the risk? I sometimes wonder if there isn't a nihilism that misses, I mean, I don't know, Fukushima's nuclear spread. I mean, most of the younger people don't even remember Chernobyl, right? So Fukushima is the sort of closest analog we have, and even that is going to seem like ancient history to a lot of people today. So I'm sort of wrestling with, how do we form thinkers to object?
Well, it's a great question, but it's also why we're in this room. Because, what institutions could take on such a project?
Yeah.
Why not religion? What if in the BU School of Theology there was, I'm sure that the classrooms here are full of discussion about inequality or climate, theological reflection on Christian and other denominational histories in relationship to climate and the environment, or theological reflection on income inequality. Harvey Cox, God and Money. Harvey Cox gave a huge course only a couple of years ago, God and Money. Well, what about, God and nukes? Why not? And so what if only a dozen students sign up for the course? If it is compelling and the teacher does it right and the students embrace the question, we're on the record, and the next thing you know, preaching. And what if preachers are under the obligation to take this up? What if, and so forth and so on. We religious people are missing the boat. State legislators and civic groups trying to take it on. We're geared for this. It's in our wheelhouse. This is what we do. This is God's earth. Did the human species come all this way to commit suicide? I mean, is that part of God's plan? What is the religious meaning of such a question? It belongs to us. Exactly belongs to us. I'm wishing for, the Catholic bishops of the United States don't have a moral leg to stand on anything, so it's not them, but who? And it wasn't them to begin with, by the way. It is, and our politics is such that individual politicians can have tremendous influence on the public discourse. So, if Bernie Sanders, Medicare for all, free college tuition, what if his other mantra, what if every time he opened his mouth he said no more nuclear weapons, stop Trump's reinvention of the nuclear age? What if that was one of the mantras? What if then the other politicians, Elizabeth Warren, picked it up? Has Elizabeth Warren ever addressed the question of nuclear weapons? It's not enough to say she's focused on economic inequality because that's her specialty. This is shameful. It's shameful. Climate is on the docket, thank God, because we're, talk about species suicide, we're in a race, whether we do it through climate degradation or through nuclear holocaust. But the nuclear holocaust is more threatening, more immediately threatening than climate degradation is. We're on the edge of a break in the dam that's been holding back proliferation. We're on the edge of it. Trump invited 6 nations to get nuclear. Trump wants Japan to have its own nuclear arsenal. He invited Saudi Arabia to have its own nuclear arsenal. He wants the United States to stop its nuclear umbrella for Europe. You guys do it. No. We don't want Saudi Arabia to have a nuclear arsenal because then the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, will have to have a nuclear arsenal. And then Jordan will have a nuclear arsenal, and Egypt will have a nuclear arsenal, etc. I mean, that's the point of getting Iran to stop, so that Egypt wouldn't feel obliged to match their nuclear weapon. This is a religious question. We are set up to do this. We are set up to do this.
I think the closest analog, you use that word, to what we grew up with is the awareness of climate change and the sort of disaster mentality that comes with that. And the challenge for people who are of whatever age in dealing with climate change to not succumb to despair.
Yes.
You spoke of shaking off the lethargy of nuclear despair. Well, people need to shake off the lethargy of climate despair. And one of our challenges is to add another despair to all what's already huge for people and for many people consuming them, and rightly so.
Yeah.
But also to show a positive path for for hope through action.
Well, that's the point of lifting up the history. We lived through this once before. The odds against moving out of the Cold War nonviolently were much greater, it was much more remote than anything we're faced with now. You know, the delicate balance of that nuclear standoff in the 1980s, that we survived that, and we did it. We did it, and we did it through ordinary citizen action. That's why that history, you know, I wasn't altogether being irreverent when I said one of our problems is we have a generation of people in power at the Pentagon and maybe in the State Department who don't remember the history.
Right.
They take for granted that we got through 1989 without a nuclear war. My father, a nuclear high priest, it was a doctrine for him that the competition between the US and the Soviet Union was going to end in a conflagration. His hope was that it wouldn't happen in the 20th century. That was his hope. Beyond that, he was convinced it could only happen that way. That was part of the doctrine of American doctrine about communism, because they don't value life the way we do, and they would be willing to sacrifice the planet. So we'll just have to sacrifice it before they do. I mean, which is what nuclear deterrence boils down to. Think of it. The entire economy and culture of the United States for 2 generations was based on the readiness to destroy the planet rather than, well, to be dead rather than to be red.
Oh, yeah. Better dead than red.
The whole species, better dead than red. That hair trigger. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was about to say, it seems even more dangerous now, because at least then we sort of recognize that if we killed them, they would kill us, or vice versa. Now we seem to have leadership that's saying, you're saying a usable, you know, a winnable nuclear war, that we could win, and I think that that's...
Well, you're right, there was an
that's
advantage.
a shift now that
Yeah.
this sort of idea of America first and America by itself, that there are winners and losers, and we could actually win.
Yeah, that's right.
Without losing our lives.
That's right.
And that's such an illusion. Whereas at least before it was like, it may have been better dead than red, but at least people knew, all right, well,
Yeah.
you're recognizing the reality would be, we're gonna be dead. I think there's a whole bunch of people who don't realize that.
That's true. The ignorance, Trump's ignorance in proclaiming actually out loud that our laser technology in space that we've just now embarked on is going to be offensive as well as defensive. As if in China, they don't read his remarks, and they're not saying to themselves, okay, got to. Yeah. Yes, sorry, someone hasn't spoken
Somebody
yet.
else,
Go ahead.
please.
I'm with you on the idea of making this a new religious movement, and I think that part of that for a new Christian movement is going to have to be specifically addressing the negative effect of the evangelical right
Mm.
and its ideology, because within that is kind of a pro-apocalypse feeling, like that it's, oh, if this world is not my home, then I don't have to protect it, to the extent that some people are, I think there's even, if not an unspoken, even a spoken idea that like, when that happens, when the conflagration happens in the Middle East, bring it on, because that's what Revelation says, and that means we're on our way. And there has to be, I think, a really definite and specifically religious response to that, that says, no, I read the same Bible, and that's a complete perversion of interpretation of Scripture.
That's a perfect example of what belongs to religion to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
A perfect example.
Very good.
And it belongs in theology departments. Reading the Bible in the light of nuclear war could be the title of the course. We'd spent a lot of time on the book of Revelation, obviously. Ronald Reagan was an apocalyptic Christian who was blasé about the prospect of a nuclear war. He said this himself, that if it's God's will, that may be God's way of renewing creation, because you see it predicted. You probably have heard this, that when Chernobyl happened, and you remember that the great thing about grace is things can happen that change everything, and those things that happen are acts of grace. The nuclear power plant that melted down in Chernobyl, Ukraine, was the thing that brought down the old guard in power in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had just become premier. He was at the mercy of the old guard. He was going to be able to do nothing, probably. Chernobyl happened, and the old guard lied about it. And there were various great figures of the Communist Party who insisted that there was no danger to the Ukrainian and then the Russian people. And it was complete, there was a radioactive cloud that went all across Europe. It killed many, many Ukrainians and infected many Russians. They sent rescuers and technicians into the plant by the hundreds who died. There was just a massive denial. It blew open the lie of the Soviet system. And Gorbachev was able to fire them all. He got rid of them all. Reagan was encouraged to believe that that Chernobyl was the beginning of the new age. And someone told him that Chernobyl, the word Chernobyl, is Ukrainian for wormwood. And wormwood is one of the symbols of the book of Revelation, that when the wood turns to wormwood, when the worms take over the wood, that's a sign of the Messianic age about to dawn. So wormwood, and when he was told that Chernobyl means wormwood, he began to work that into his speeches, that Chernobyl means the beginning of the end, because the Messianic age is here. The trouble Reagan had was that he couldn't keep his woods straight, and he would call it Wedgwood. Chernobyl means Wedgwood. And people would say, what? And Wedgwood, as we all know, is a symbol of the coming of the Messianic age. People say, what? Well, I meant that other. Really.
And it doesn't mean wormwood
It
anyhow.
doesn't mean wormwood.
It doesn't mean wormwood anyway. What does it mean?
Well, Sharon means black or dark.
Uh-huh.
That's the root, so I don't know what the bill means.
Yeah.
Means white or light. My dad used to have a joke, next time we should do it in color. Chernobyl, black and white.
Oh, that's cool.
That's good. Yeah.
In keeping with that history, though, I also remember that Jimmy Carter had to deal with Three Mile Island, and so that kept it in the public's attention span.
It's true. It's true. My wife was pregnant when 3 Mile Island happened. We were living in Boston, and for a couple of days there were wind patterns that were being tracked to tell people where the plume of radiation was going to go. And we, like a lot of people we knew who were pregnant, took off. We had the map of the likely place the cloud was gonna go, and we drove out of it. So, yeah, 3 Mile Island was a trauma. And there was in that period, as you remember, a lot of popular entertainment based around nuclear horror.
Yes.
There was a movie called 3 Mile Island, there was the China Syndrome.
Jason
Yeah.
Robards
Yeah.
narrated a film about the end of the world.
Yeah,
I can't remember what it was.
The
That
Day
was on
After.
public, that was on TV.
right.
Yeah.
And Cosmos, the great astronomer Carl Sagan, was obsessed with, he introduced the idea of nuclear winter, remember that? Other comments or questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, when we go from this place, you know, we're all students or we have our own religious settings and we're serving in different capacities, what do you recommend? You talk about kind of a movement, ground movement of the public. What do you recommend for us?
Well, one thing I would recommend strategically is, we're all close to the conversation about climate. And nuclear dread needs to be part of that conversation. That's already been well mobilized. I'm sure there are many engaged students at VU who are very committed to doing something to rescue the climate. And it's just a matter of getting the click in the brain. This is the same problem. But this one is different because nobody's paying attention to it. And it's just as dangerous. And Trump, what I began my remarks with, every week there's yet another ratcheting down of this structure of arms control. It's being dismantled right in front of us. It needs to be on the public screen.
It's not. It's not.
I know, it needs to be there.
Writing letters.
That would be a.
Right, well, you know,
I
but,
mean, that's not an insignificant thing to
but
do.
I also remember, you know, I mean, being at BU in the 60s, in the 1960s, you know, students are, you're completely right about students having been traumatized by nuclear dread as children. And that was who the anti-war movement students were. But they saw it before their professors saw it.
I would suggest looking up Back from the Brink,
Yeah, back from the brink.
because this is
absolutely.
an existing campaign. It's already nationwide, doesn't mean it's in every state. It has a strategy. It's something that a congregation or a school could look into and possibly attach itself to. Whether one sponsors that or passes that, it's got a lot of material,
Mhm.
so it's kind of ready-made,
Yeah,
instead of,
it's a great idea.
yeah.
You should tell them what it is, because
Well,
I think.
Back from the Brink is, again, the Union of Concerned Scientists, I believe.
Well, it's the UN, the General Assembly of the UN voted almost unanimously
Summer
Or-
before last,
the summer before last
Yeah.
to end.
to end nuclear weapons. They were responding to Trump, what they saw in Trump.
I think so, I'm sorry, I just
No,
think
thank
that,
you.
Yeah,
that.
That's
that
good,
would-
I didn't
Yeah.
know that
It's
background.
really a
it's a call for the
worldwide-
elimination of nuclear weapons
Right.
from the UN General Assembly.
I think Daniel Ellsberg's book, and I'm forgetting what the name of it is.
Doomsday.
Doomsday is also something which would help you to find things that you could say to people in a sermon or in a conversation about this, because he was he saw the need for writing his book too, much as you did.
Mhm.
And I think your talk, you should publish it, because it's very valuable.
Other comments? Yes, sir.
A professor at this university for many years, I'm referring to Gordon Zahn, who was active in the peace movement. He was a conscientious objector during the Second World War, known as a pacifist generally. Now, what I'm wondering, given he was active in conscientious objection for many years, but what I think what he was saying basically is, we're at a point where as Christians we should be uniting like the Christians before Constantine. They were basically pacifists. They had the big oppressor, but they didn't fight it. They were willing to be led like martyrs if they had to, but using kind of nonviolent resistant things in order to resist the empire, the violence. Now, is that type of approach practical? Can we expect Christians to go that far under present conditions, or is there any way of avoiding that and still keep going? I mean, if we're in a bind, it seems to me we're almost pushed back to that position.
Well, it's another important point. I knew and loved Gordon Zahn. He was an important person in my life. Thank you for lifting him up. The thing about nuclear war is it changes the entire discussion about violence and nonviolence. There's an old argument against pacifism as such, that it's irresponsible. But the argument, and I don't make that argument, but that's the old argument. But the argument changes when nuclear weapons are brought into the story. And that's what changed the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was a just war church. Gordon Zahn was a Catholic. He stood against the idea of the just war. But the Catholic Church defined itself around the idea of the just war since St. Augustine. Why was St. Augustine offering the just war theory in the 4th century into the 5th century? Is it a coincidence that it was a few decades after Constantine? After, that is, the church became the empire? After, that is, the church began to use the power of the state to enforce orthodoxy? The church needed a just war theory if it was going to be linked at the hip to the empire. And it got one. And the just war theory defined Catholic moral theology about violence until 1965. Pope Paul VI at the United Nations gave a great it came to the United Nations. Lyndon Johnson, my father was a senior Catholic in the United States Air Force. He went to New York to be part of Cardinal Spellman's greeting of, Cardinal Spellman was the military vicar, as we say, to be part of the greeting of the Pope. Cardinal Spellman, my father, Lyndon Johnson, all expected Pope Paul VI, the great enemy of communism. Catholic Church hated communism. Paul VI was going to come just in time, 65. It was the spring. Johnson had just launched Operation Rolling Thunder. That is to say, Johnson had just launched his own phase of the war in Vietnam. Pope Paul VI was going to come and affirm it and give a talk about the dangers of communism. It's going to be great. Read the speech. He resoundingly ends by, he gave it in French. I won't try to render it in French, but no more war. War, his fist went up. War, never again. That's how he ended his speech. No more war, war, never. I said to my father the next week, well, Dad, the Pope, no more war? My father was, and he said, well, you know, the Pope's job is to hold up the ideal. People like us, we have to live in the real. Realism, right? Anyway, but the threat of nuclear war changes the entire, which goes back to your point. There needs to be, I wish there were, at every theology school, every seminary, serious courses on religion and violence, especially in the American context. Evangelical religion and its embrace of righteous violence, but the atonement theory, the idea that God wills violence, that God is violent. God requires, how does God save the world? By murdering his only begotten Son. How does God bring about the end of history? By destroying the creation. What kind of God is that? Who wants to sit blissfully at the feet for all eternity of such a monster? That's the God of mainstream Christian theology. St. Anselm's atonement theory. Is that unpacked? I'm sure there are courses here on St. Anselm, but is his the meaning for political violence addressed when we talk about if God requires a savage act of violence as a way to redeem the world, to make up for the sin of Adam causing infinite offense has to be atoned for through an act of infinite suffering. And the only way the suffering can be infinite is if the being whose suffering is divine. That's why God became a man. That's the name of Anselm's treatise, you know this. 1098. Is it a coincidence? Augustine, 1490, the Empire. Is it a coincidence, the just war theory? 1098. Is it a coincidence? A God who requires violence to redeem the world? What's happening in 1098? The Crusaders are closing in on Jerusalem. The Crusades are the first acts of violence regarded by the church as holy. And now we have a theology to justify it. And that theology is still in place. Yes, ma'am.
Hold up the contemporary members of the Catholic Worker Movement who are regularly crossing the line at nuclear missile sites and getting themselves arrested as a protest to the whole nuclear arms situation. And it's still going on, and not everybody can cross the line, but some
There have
do.
been noble witnesses. The Plowshares movement is
Yep.
what you're referring to.
Yep.
And it's not happening as much as it did, but it's not gone. Liz McAllister is still alive. She'll probably go to jail yet one more time before she dies.
I got a former student from Loyola, Chicago, here in town, and a former Jesuit scholastic who's now married and has a couple of kids. He spent 6 months in a federal penitentiary for crossing the line at a nuclear missile site.
Good for him. Maybe we'll wind it up with one more comment or question. Judith?
Yeah, I'm curious, Jim, with the people that you've talked with over the years about this issue, especially religious people, religious leaders. Susan mentioned one level of resistance among evangelicals, but in general, what is the resistance? You mentioned the lack of history with the nuclear fear, but what do you think is the current resistance of religious leaders to think about this, reflect on it, act on it?
Well, let me just stick with my own tradition, which is what I know, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, the Challenge of Peace, the great statement by the Catholic Bishop, 1983, and there was a kind of movement in the church that took hold and was vivid. The person who wrote that statement, by the way, was Father Brian Hare, who's a figure at Harvard and a priest of the Archdiocese of Boston. But the Catholic Church and the Catholic leadership had the same reaction to the trauma of 9/11 that the American people did. It was like a laser weapon aimed at our moral consciousness, and it zapped it big time. I include myself in that. We as a people lost our moral compass at 9/11. It's at the worst possible time, because the great transition of 1989 had given us a golden moment. And in the 1990s, remember that once Reagan began nuclear weapons reduction, the process of destroying nuclear weapons kept going. So under Reagan and George H.W. Bush, the nuclear arsenal was cut in half. The nuclear arsenal was cut modestly under Bill Clinton, but there was no question of returning to it. The great, terrible moment, in my view, came with the first Gulf War, which was before 9/11. It was in the early 1990s. 1991, wasn't it? And when George H.W. Bush lost patience with the sanctions that were pressing Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait and launch the war against Saddam in Kuwait. Basically, the catastrophic mess we're in now began. And 9/11 came out of that. Osama bin Laden was offended by the arrival of the infidel armies, the Crusaders, back into the Holy Land, and so forth. But once 9/11 happened, we stopped, we completely lost our moral way. That's when pulpits absolutely went silent on political questions, not just war and peace, but race, inequality. You don't hear preaching. I don't know about this school or the preaching that's taught here, but pulpits went radio silent on political, large public questions. Out of the trauma. We were a traumatized people. We still are, obviously. And all of that, of course, was eating away at the moral center of our commonwealth. And the great revelation of that hollowness is the present moment that we've inflicted on ourselves. But we don't have to be at the mercy of it. That's why I began by lifting up these major public events that occurred in the last 10 days and will occur on Saturday, and desperate for Rachel Maddow or any of them to lift up these questions, and desperate for a return to this huge issue, because what's at stake isn't American happiness, it's the future of the species. Well, here I am back at BU, and I still blather on. The students were patient.
Thank you very much for being here. And we, RCT, and I want to introduce Tim Von Lint, Director of Cura, who's also supported this event. I hope that this is the beginning of many more conversations that we can have here. And I really thank you for your call and your witness. So, thank you.